Hey, good morning. This is Clover, and I'm here because I am going to set an upcoming gas or genuinely approachable Sudoku puzzle on camera in order to give you, if you're a setter, a little bit of a peek into how my process might be similar to or different from yours. And if you're not a setter, if you're just interested in solving these puzzles, just a look at how they get made, a little bit of a behind the scenes. And the specific inspiration for this gas came from the instruction booklet for the World Sudoku Championship, which is actually happening right now at the time that I'm recording this. And it's this quad max Sudoku you see in the middle of the screen here. If you have been solving gas for a little while, you're probably familiar with the name quad max Sudoku. We posted a run of 3 quad max Sudokus with kind of silly introductions recently. And in our quad max variant, um, there were actually circles at the intersections of 4 cells, and each circle had a digit in it, and that digit represented the largest, possibly non-unique, but the largest value in the 4 cells surrounding the circle. And we posted a series of gas puzzles with that rule set. It turned out, and we only realized this well after the fact, that Quad Max, the name, had already been used for a different Sudoku variant, kind of a more traditional one, and this is the variant that name had been used for. Um, and I was delighted and surprised to see that original Quad Max variant show up in the instruction booklet for the World Sudoku Championship, and that inspired me to maybe pay homage to whoever originally named Quad Max and maybe apologize for stealing the name from them and on behalf of Gas and set a Quad Max Sudoku using like the original Quad Max rules. So the rules in this version of Quad Max are a little different. You see you've got arrows at the intersections of groups of 4 cells, and the rule says that the arrow points to whichever of those 4 cells has the highest value. And the rules make it clear, so the way they actually phrase it is the digit pointed by the arrow is larger than the other 3 digits touching that corner. And what jumps into my head when I read that is that's definitely trying to imply that the largest digit is always going to be unique because it says larger than the other 3, which is different from our original quad max rules from Gas, where the largest digit wasn't necessarily unique. So we've got a unique largest digit, possibly non-unique smaller digits, and then the arrow points to the largest digit. And I'm going to try to set a gas on camera using this rule set. And hopefully, if all goes well, I'm going to post this video as the introduction for this gas. So I decided before I started recording this that I'm going to set in Penpa today, which is not usual for me. Normally I set in F puzzles. The reason I'm going to use Penpa is actually because there is a script for F puzzles that lets you copy and paste shapes like arrows into your puzzle as you're setting it. I have had a lot of trouble getting that script to work consistently on my system. And so in order to kind of have a little more freedom to paste arrows into the grid where I need them without having to fiddle around with it to make it work, I'm going to use Penpa, which is nice in that it gives you a lot more diverse options kind of by default to put things like shapes and arrows and lines into the grid, because it's more of a general pencil puzzle setting tool than a Sudoku specific tool. It gives you kind of this overwhelming array of options you can use, but on top of that, it also lets you relatively easily do things like what I'm trying to do by putting little arrows into specific locations in the grid. And so before I start, I'm actually going to take a moment and figure out what kind of arrow I'm going to use. The reason I'm doing this now is just because when I'm setting, I find that if I have to pause and think like, oh, how am I going to typeset this? Like, how am I literally going to physically put it in the grid? That kind of takes me out of the flow. And so I like to just have like my tools laid out in front of me before I start. And so I'm going to find an arrow shape that I'm going to use for this whole thing. So I'm guessing fat arrow is probably going to be too big. Thin arrow. Okay, that is a little too big. I worry that that would overlap pencil marks, but we can hang on to that for now. Triangular, probably not. Four edge, I know what that is. That's all just like straight arrows. Short and fat arrow looks like, okay, that may actually be, well, these arrows are like a little smaller and lighter than that. But I think short and fat may be, well, I don't know. That's kind of a trade-off between like readability and not getting in the way of pencil marking. Honestly, I like the way that the short fat arrow looks a little bit better, just aesthetically. Cross, no. Ooh. Oh, actually, I know what this is, and I know that this is not going to work because you can't actually put this particular arrow right on an intersection of grid edges, so that's not going to work for us. An arrow tip. Okay, we're going with short and fat. And that's something that I reserve the right to change later, but I just want to have something kind of in my toolkit that I can just use on the fly while I'm setting to indicate where I'm putting these arrows. And so now I'm going to draw my grid. I don't need to do anything fancy, I just need a normal Sudoku grid. Whoops. Should not have done that because now Penpa is kind of angry at me. It doesn't like when you remove rows or columns from the grid that you have drawn things in already. And I understand that there's no logical reason like you would want to do that on purpose, but I do it by accident pretty regularly, and I'm not totally sure how to fix it when I do it, so I just restarted. Now here's my grid. This is the grid I'm going to set this puzzle in. I know where to find my arrows. It's under shape, arrow, or no, it's not. It's under shape. Yeah, shape, arrow, short and fat. I'm going to have border turned on. I have the rule that says that the arrow is pointing to the largest of 4 digits uniquely. So now we're ready to roll. Now, gas usually, at least my gas puzzles, generally start with thinking about how do I distill like the simplest possible version of the idea behind this constraint. Like I like to give people a quote unquote break-in to each gas puzzle in the form of like an easy win almost, in the form of something that just says, okay, here's a little piece of the puzzle where as long as you understand the constraint, you don't need to understand anything complicated about what it implies, but as long as you understand literally just what the constraint is saying, you'll be able to at least make this first move. That builds confidence. It confirms to people that they've understood the constraint correctly, and it gives them, you know, some free digits to kind of create like a toehold in the puzzle. And so my thinking of like what's the simplest possible quad max situation is literally just to have a scenario where either we're given 2 or even 3 digits, like around a quad, like 1, 2, 3 or something like that, and then we have an arrow. So that would be one example of kind of distilling this quad max constraint into something really simple. Or maybe we could be given just like 1 digit, except it is the digit the arrow is pointing at. So like, for instance, if I gave that as a 4, then I would know that that had to be 1, 2, 3. I'm kind of liking that actually, because that doesn't feel absolutely trivial. I think that still takes just enough thinking to kind of feel like a win when you see that. But it's also something that just follows instantly from knowing what the constraint says and understanding what understanding just like how kind of the numbers work in a Sudoku grid and just like what digits you have available, which ones are bigger than others. So just like doesn't require you to go any deeper with what you know, but it just kind of checks on what you know. Then another option is so The constraint made it clear that the largest digit had to be unique, but also the rules kind of took pains to explain that the other digits, the smaller ones, don't necessarily have to be unique. And that gives us maybe this opportunity, where if we had a construction like this and we kind of gave a 3, we know that 3 has to be the unique largest digit, which would mean that these have to be all 1 and 2, which gives us this nice kind of pointing 1-2 pair. And I kind of like this because this actually harkens back to some of the Quad Max puzzles that we posted in GAS. And now, when setting GAS, I do make a sincere effort not to make assumptions about difficulty based on, oh, we've used this in GAS before. Because I never want people to feel like when they come into the GAS solving community that there's kind of this barrier to entry based on like, oh, I'm not going to understand it unless I've already solved all of the earlier ones, unless I've already solved all 150 other puzzles. And even though I know that would never be true, I also just don't want people to ever feel like that, whether it's true or not. I don't want people to feel like that barrier exists. And because of that, I try to look at the difficulty of each move that I'm putting into a puzzle kind of in a vacuum, not thinking, oh, we've used this in a puzzle before, so it's easier, but instead thinking, okay, to somebody who just walked into this and just read the rules, how natural does this feel? And so even though I like the fact personally that this move here kind of harkens back to an earlier Quad Max puzzle, I'm not going to make assumptions about how good of a move it is just based on the fact that it does that. I think that that's a risky thing to do. But I'm going to hang on to that as a possibility. Another thing that we could maybe do is we could actually set something up. This is kind of the fourth thing that I can think of here as just an early move. We can set something up where, say, we know every other digit in a house. In this case, probably a box would be the easiest way to do this. So if we set up like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there, that tells you that this quad contains 6, 7, 8, and 9, which places a 9 if there's an arrow there. So that's another possible early move. And now the temptation for me is to do this actually not by setting it up the way I just showed you, but to try to make it like more interesting and to set it up creating like a hidden quad, for instance. So like the temptation for me is going to be not to give those cells as givens, but instead to do something like this in the grid. Where those are givens, which creates a hidden 6, 7, 8, 9 quad and would also force a 9 if I put an arrow there. I don't love designing GAS puzzles that rely on things like that. I think that that's a valid move for later in a GAS, and I don't actually think that that move is like inherently difficult. But part of my kind of design philosophy for GAS is that I don't like it to feel as if logical moves as you're solving a puzzle are locked away behind other things where if you don't see them, you don't have access to the move. And so I don't like the idea of setting up a scenario where if you don't see that this kind of construction gives you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6, 7, 8, 9 in this box, then you don't have access to the fact that this arrow is meaningful. So I'm going to kill that. The last thing I kind of want to think about before I start is situations where arrows like point to each other or kind of share a box. I think this has a lot of promise. Like I think a lot of the time in GAS, what I do with constraints is I I kind of like to marry them up in ways that like really, really force them to extremes. So, and this is just me kind of playing at this point because I actually don't know what this is going to come out as. Like if I put 2 arrows in a box like that, I know that's got to be at least 4. And so this has to be greater than that. This cell actually has to be greater than the greatest number here. And it has to be greater than both of these. So this might be a good move for like later in a puzzle. Like this pink cell with this setup with 2 arrows sharing a box has to be greater than all of the orange cells. And so it has to be greater than at least 6 other digits, so it can only be 7, 8, or 9. So if I was setting a non-gas puzzle, if I was just trying to set like a quote-unquote easy puzzle, because gas puzzles are not the same thing as easy puzzles. Like I don't think this is a very hard deduction. I don't think this would be out of place in an easy puzzle, but I think it is not a good early deduction for a gas puzzle. But if I was just setting like an easy puzzle, I might give actually like an 8 and a 9 as givens here. Leave these cells all blank. And then rely on the solver to figure out, okay, the smallest this can possibly be is 7, so it has to be 7. That implies that these 2 cells are 8 and 9. Oh, I actually really like this. I wonder if this would be... Oh, I really want to put this in this puzzle because I like that move a lot. What I like about it is that it has this extremely natural follow-through where if you place the givens, how I just kind of happened to place them there, you get this really natural second move where once you see that 8 and 9 can't be in any of the arrow cells, you know that this is an 8-9 pair, and that means that has to be a 9, that has to be an 8, because you kind of harken back to that 8 and 9 that you just used to get the 7, and you use them to fix that 8-9 pair, which is something that like feels really good to solvers in my opinion. So I really, really, really like that. I'm gonna hang on to that because for the reasons I described, I don't want that to be the opening move of this puzzle, but I do want it to be a move in this puzzle. So I'm going to clean up. I think I'm comfortable at this point with what I know about this constraint, although I guarantee you that I'm going to come up with other pieces of logic as I'm working once I have more in the grid. But I'm pretty comfortable with my kind of familiarity with it at this point, and I'm going to start setting. And when I set, I know this is a little weird, but everybody's process is different. I always color givens in green, and I tend to also use coloring to indicate places in the grid where I've developed a large amount of pressure, I guess. Places where I have a thought like, oh, it would just take kind of one more move to collapse this into a known value, but I don't quite want to do it just yet. So I'm going to open with that nice, easy opening deduction that we established earlier. And I'm going to literally put it in the top left corner. If you ever want to know where to start one of my gas puzzles, the answer is probably top left corner. Because I don't think that there's any reason to try to switch that up. Like, in a contest puzzle where you're trying really hard to control the difficulty to a particular level that might be harder than, like, super easy, then one tool in your toolkit for controlling your difficulty, for better or for worse, is going to be hiding things around the grid. You know, forcing your solver to really search the grid for the next move. In gas, I never try to hide things. Like, just I just don't try to hide things from the solver whatsoever. And because of that, I don't see any advantage to not just kind of always putting the break in the same place. If somebody wants to like hunt for things around the grid, there are a lot of other puzzles at different levels that will let them do that. So I'm actually going to put this down here. The reason I'm going to put it down there is because that gives me kind of this natural next move where if I give a 3 here, I can do something like this. And I can use that move that oh, that's actually not going to work. So I was thinking I could do something like this, where if I put a 3 here, I would get a follow-up where it would force a 3 here, and it would give me this 1, 2, but then I end up with 3 cells that all have a 1 and 2 in them. So that ain't gonna work. Now, what if... Here's a question. What if I actually opened this with a 5? So if I open that with a 5, I know that the 3 cells smaller than it have to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And let's actually, just for the sake of aesthetics, let's actually move this over to the left one. And let's make this a 3. Because what that accomplishes is that immediately restricts these values to a triple that's kind of known. And so I'm going to make that 3 a given. And I know, therefore, that all of these cells have to be 1 and 2. Now, I know, as a solver who has more experience, that that implies that one of these 2 cells has to be a 4, which means there isn't a 4 there. I'm not going to assume that for the purposes of creating my next move in this puzzle, just because that's an example of something that I don't want to assume a gas solver will see. So I'm not actually even going to mark it. I don't think that I would get any really exciting follow through from that regardless, but I'm not even going to mark it just because I don't want to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, that's just something everybody solving this puzzle will know at this point, so I can safely use it. No, I'm not even going to do that. So now I have this 1, 2 pair, I have a 1, 2 pair here. And I'm almost thinking that I'd like my next move to be something that follows on from that 1, 2 pair. So one thing that's popping into my head is to put a 4 as a given here, which would place a 4 and give me 2 1, 2 pairs. But what I really want to do is put in something where I can use it as part of another quad clue. So if I put, like, let's say, another 5 there. No, I don't love that. Well, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4 here. So at this point, maybe I can do something like this. At this point, maybe I can put, like, if I put a 7 here, and I made that part of a quad clue. And by the way, there's no particular reason I'm making all of my arrows point the same direction. It's literally just trying to kind of build up aesthetic theming at the same time as I'm building up logical theming. So I can't have 1, 2, 3, or 4 down here. So these 2 cells have to be 5 or 6. And that would make this a 7, 8, 9 triple. Now, what if I were to play on that and make this guy another given? Let's make that an 8. And let's actually have an arrow pointing the opposite direction. Because then I get to use my other move where now I know because this is greater than an 8, it's a 9. That makes that a 7, that makes that a 9. That resolves that kind of slightly scary 7, 8, 9 triple that I was building up over there. So now this has to be 1, 2, 3, or 4 because it has to be less than 7. Okay. I don't hate this. I don't hate this at all. At this point, what's jumping out at me is that I am kind of building up this a little bit of an aesthetic theme with where I'm placing my givens. And so I'm probably going to change this, but I'm going to just do a little highlighting in the grid to maybe lay out where some attractive places to put the rest of the givens might be. Like for instance, that doesn't really preserve I have like such a thing for rotational symmetry. It's just absolutely grotesque. I honestly have to get over it because it's to the point where I find myself like not setting things as well as I could just in an attempt to try to keep them rotationally symmetric. Um so that would be a really cute rotationally symmetric layout of givens that kind of plays nicely with what I've already got, so I could use that. Let's just roll with that. I'm just gonna leave those cells highlighted for now, and we're just gonna see if we can work with those being our givens. That kind of naturally presents this, where if I used a 5 here, that would fix this 5 and 6, which is nice. That's a nice kind of immediate move. And on top of that, that gives me an opportunity to use an arrow here, for example, where, and this is something that I hesitate with a little bit. Like, I think most gas solvers are going to kind of see this as a 1, 2, 3, 4 quad, which is not wrong. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's just leave that for now and kind of mull it over. And if at that point, if we made this an 8 and we had an arrow pointing this way, then we would be able to conclude that this has to be a 6-7 pair. And then we fix the 6-7 pair immediately because of that 7 given we already had. And that's like a little bit leaning towards the tricky side, but not... I feel like it's satisfying enough that justifies it. I don't know, I feel like this gas is leaning in the direction of being kind of challenging, and I don't love that. Like, I tend to try to set them easier rather than harder. So here I see another opportunity, though, where I have this 3-4 pair effectively with the 5, and I also have this 1, 2, 4 situation here, where we already know that can't be a 4, but we're just kind of pretending we don't know that yet. And what that says to me is if I place a 4 there, that actually fixes both of those things at once. This does make me want to put a given up here to immediately disambiguate the 1, 2 pairs, because I find it kind of stressful to have something like that just like floating in my grid, both as a setter and as a solver. And so I'm gonna do that. It's possible that I will eventually undo that, but I'm gonna just give a 1, which makes this a 2, makes that a 1, makes that a 2-4 pair, kills my 1 and 2 there, and resolves this. So what do I have left here? I have 3, 4, 8, and 9 here. And that can't be a 3. Those can't be 8, so that's actually an 8. Again, gonna kind of mark that to like not rely on that too heavily, because I feel like that was a pretty chunky series of like Sudoku specific moves to get that. And same with this, that does eventually make this an 8, but I'm not gonna like rely on that. I'm just gonna leave that as one of those things where it's nice if you find it. So this becomes a 6, 7, 9 triple. That's a 3, 4. This is now a 9. And again, highlighting in orange as it's kind of like a dangerous conclusion that we've arrived at there. It's a conclusion that's correct, but it's a conclusion that I'm not 100% confident everybody solving this is going to see immediately. That's kind of the whole story there. Okay, so what are we looking at now? We have, I guess, the natural next place to look would be this row here, because it's below this row that was really driving the beginning of the solve. And it only has 3 free digits. They all have to be 6, 7, or 8. It doesn't really interact with any of the positions I've already laid out for givens. That's not necessarily a problem. So let's think. I could force a 9 and I can't force a 9 in one of those cells. So I was going to say, now that I have this as an 8, an arrow would force a 9 because it's greater than 8, but I can't put a 9 in either of those cells because they actually both see 9s at this point. What do I have up here? This has got to be 1, 3, 4, and 6. This has to be 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. So I don't see a move that I really love that follows naturally on from what I've already placed at this point. And so the move I'm going to use at this point is I'm going to reuse something. I already used this kind of logical move up here at the very beginning where you're meant to observe that we have a small number with an arrow pointing at it. And what I have noticed here in this box right now, box 6, is that I have a pair of small digits that are kind of pointing into that box, and that should be something that you've established relatively recently at this point in the solve. And so if I place like a 4 there, I know I have a bunch of free small digits, so like that's not necessarily going to create a problem. I'm going to have an arrow pointing into that 4. And because I have these 2s pointing into this box, this has to be 1, 2, 3, but the 2 can't go there or there, it has to go there. That leaves 5, 6, 7, 8 here. So that can't be a 6 or an 8, that can't be a 7. And now I'm kind of opening up an opportunity to do some Sudoku here, because I have this like pillar of 3 high digits, and then I've got my 1 remaining free high digit over here. And so if I make this given a 7, that's going to resolve a lot of that situation, but not all of it, which is nice. So that cleared up some of what was going on here. And now just cleaning up some pencil marks, I think I'm good there. Okay. At that point, I can fill in some more over here. So that's 5, 6, 8, or 9. So this is actually 4 cells kind of from the same set of digits to quadruple. So this is 1, 3, or 7. That can't be 1. That can't be 3. Now, where do we go from here? Probably the most recent things, so the things that are freshest on people's minds at this point, are going to be either this whole situation that they just worked out down here, or this triple, and I'm kind of into the idea of using this triple, because here's something kind of cool that could work. If I place a 7 here as well, I'm probably just like breaking the puzzle without realizing it. That would make this a 1. That kills the 7 up here. And if I place an arrow here, that's kind of fun, because that forces people, in a fairly gentle way, I think, to use that rule that says your number has to be unique, like your largest digit on a quad has to be unique. So we're going to kill the 7 there. That actually gives us a 7 up here. Again, I'm going to be very careful of this kind of part of the grid when I'm test solving. I'm starting to get a sense that I would ideally like to have some givens in these corners, just to reduce the amount of Sudoku that has to be done later on. So I'm going to add marks for givens there and there, because I kind of want to give away this stuff now. I don't want to force people to use the variant constraint in like a really fussy, tedious, complicated way to try to figure out like what order this 6, 7, 8, 9 stuff goes in. I want to kind of hand that to them. And so to do that, I'm going to make this an 8, which gives me a... Oh, that's not actually going to work. So I actually did not even notice I have a 6, 8, 9 triple here. That's a good example of something that, I mean, if I don't notice it at first while I'm setting, I don't think that I can rely on the majority of my solvers noticing it immediately. I mean, that's the kind of thing that makes a puzzle feel annoying, if it's something you just feel like you have to notice by happenstance. So I know, but at this point my solvers don't necessarily know that that cell can no longer be an 8 thanks to that triple. And I also know, but again, I don't think my solvers necessarily know that that has to be 1, 2, 3. And this is kind of boxes me into a corner a little bit, because I really wanted to like make this part of the grid an easy win where I just like give a digit that resolves all of this situation. And so now I need to think of another way to do it. And what has just popped into my head is, what if I give them this? So that 7, I think we, and this will all come out in test solving, that 7 I think we got relatively easily. This does force a 6 because the 6 is now in the same quad as the 7. That gives us an 8 and a 9. That kills the 9 there. That is now an 8 and a 6, so that's not a 6. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4. And I do like that. I think that's kind of a nice way to resolve that. So let's do a little more pencil marking. I tend to go fairly heavy on the pencil marking while I'm setting. I don't necessarily recommend doing that unless you've kind of worked at developing the skill of intuiting what pencil marks your solvers are likely to have at a particular point. If you just assume that your solvers are going to have their pencil marks exactly as thorough as your pencil marks are while you're setting, you're kind of setting yourself up for disappointment. Like, what that leads to is puzzles that have these like very obscure, you know, pairs and triples and quadruples that you saw because you had meticulously pencil marked everything, but that it's not necessarily realistic to expect your solvers to see on the fly. But I'm pencil marking stuff in just because I want to know, like, for practical purposes, what do I have available to me here? That's 1, 2, 4, 9. Okay. So what I see... Oh, that looked like a good opportunity. So I'll tell you what I was thinking, but then I'll tell you why it's not going to work. So what I was seeing here was an opportunity to repeat this deduction yet again by putting a 4 with an arrow here. But that would actually force me to put a 3 there, which would actually break that cell. So I can't do that. I cannot get away with that. What I can do is I can put a 5 there, and I can grab this deduction again, basically, and I can put an arrow pointing at the 5. And I can place that there. And this is going to end up being a given for symmetry purposes, but I don't know what value I want it to have yet. That can't be a 6, so that's a 6. That's now a 3, 4 pair. I now know that given definitely can't be a 9, so whatever that given is, that is going to end up forcing a 9 here. I like the idea of putting a 4 in this cell, because that resolves the 3, 4 by value to its left. But I also like the idea of putting a 2 in that cell, because it resolves the 2, 4 by value above it in a way that makes the resolution of this cell kind of maximal, which is something that often leads to being able to get that deduction earlier than you could otherwise. Like, if this ends up resolving out to be a 4, that's like, it's quite likely that kind of the pressure on that will lead that to become an easier deduction to pick up earlier on. I think I'm going to take the cheap option there, though. I'm going to make that a given 4. That's a 3. That's now a 2 and a 1, so this actually resolves down here. That fixes all of this stuff that I've kind of had dangling up here. 2, 3, 5, 1, 4, 6. That's going to clear up some of this, too. That gives me a 4. It's 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9. That's not a 6 or a 9. This cell is the same as this one. I'm going to color that because I want to remember that for my own process, but I'm not going to assume that my solvers know it. This is a triple. It's a 2, 7, 8. This is a 4, of course. These are not 7s because we have given 7s. That's a 7. And that's now a 2, 8 pair. Okay. I see kind of an easy get here that I could use. So what I'm looking at now is the 7 next to a 5, 8 buy value. I just don't know if I can safely assume that people are going to have that available at this point. I do like, though, that if I force this to be a 5, that resolves a lot of my bottom left corner. So I'm going to roll with that for now. I'm just going to kind of keep a close eye on it when I'm testing. So what I want is for this not to be the highest. Oh, God. I actually can't force that to be a 5, I don't think. So I can't force it to be a 5 because what I would want to do to make that happen is I would want to have the arrow pointing at the 7. But I actually can't do that, because then my smallest possible 3 other digits there would be 5, 6, and 8. And of course, 8 is one of those and it's bigger than 7. So that's not the right way to do it. I could force this value to be an 8 by having the arrow pointing at it. That would also give me a 9 down here. That would give me some pairs that I kind of can't really resolve, to be honest. Like, it would kind of give me like some 5, kind of a 5, 6 situation, I guess. Well, actually, no. So if I have the arrow pointing here, I do know that has to be bigger than 7. I know it can't be 9 because I have a 9 here. So that's an 8. That can't be a 9. That's now a 5, 6 pair. Yeah, this is no good because that leads to what is going to turn into a deadly pattern unless I like add some givens or really take pains to deal with that. So I'm going to ditch that for now. I imagine there's probably some stuff that I can do over here that will cause something nice to kind of fall out of that more naturally. Okay. I can definitely force the 2 versus 8 situation. Okay, here's an idea. We can actually force this to be a 5 if we force this to be an 8. And the way we force this to be an 8 is we place an arrow right there. Because we know that this is a buy value. It's a pair. And so we know that the arrow can only be pointing at the larger member of the pair, which has to be an 8. That's now a 5, that's a 6. That's a 5, that's a 6. These are neither 5 nor 6. That's an 8, 9 pair. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. That's not a 2, that's not a 4, and so on. This gives me a good opportunity to resolve the top right part of the grid with a given here. I'm just going to hold off on that. All I know about this is that this cannot be a 9. That does technically give me a 9. It gives me a hidden 9 in column 7. However, I hate using hiddens in rows and columns in gas. I feel like it is something that people really don't naturally look for unless they're like really making an effort to scan really cleanly. And because of that, I feel like that contributes, like it has kind of an outsized contribution to how difficult a puzzle feels when you include hiddens in rows and columns. And so I want a way to make that turn into a 9 without them having to see that that's going to be a 9. So I'm going to hold off on that now, and I'm just going to highlight that cell to remind myself that that is going to turn into something. Well, okay, maybe. How about this? How about we do it like this? We make that a 3. That's going to resolve some of this stuff. That's going to turn that into a 5. That's going to... And now they have the option of viewing this as like a... Oh, well, that's not going to work, because now they would be viewing this as a 4, 6, 9 triple, and that would actually force this to be a 9, which is no bueno. Let's not make that a 3. Let's make that a 1. That's now a 4, 6, and that once again is a 9. Is this actually forced to be a 9 no matter what we do? It is not. So if and only if we make this a 4, then we get this route through it, where this is 1, 3, 5, 6, and 9. We know that that can't be a 3 or a 6. I know it can't be a 9. I know that ends up being a 9. Oh, I kind of hate this. Honestly, I kind of hate this. Is it possible, maybe, to add an arrow up in the top right corner that will fix this for me? Yeah, you know what? I'm going to stop screwing around with this, and I'm just going to add more use of the variant glues, to be honest. I am actually going to take it in this direction. I'm going to use an arrow to force the 8 versus 9 situation here. This arrow, because I know I have an 8-9 pair, has to be pointing at the 9, making that an 8. This, therefore... Oh, that's not going to work. I have to do it backwards. I've got to use an arrow to point at this 9. Okay. So that's going to be a 9. That's going to be an 8. This now, like, pretty obviously can't be a 9, so now I'm more comfortable kind of leveraging the deduction that that's a 9. That's a 2-3 pair. That's a 6. That's a 1 and a 6. Okay. 3, 1, 5, 3, 2, 5. That's now a 2, 3, and 1. That resolves. That's now a 1, 3, and 2. Okay. And that resolves our grid. So that's round 1. We've got a puzzle down on paper. So our next step is going to be to clone this. And we're going to clear out the grid. I colored my givens green, so I know which cells are going to be givens. And I'm going to clear everything out, and I'm going to test solve it. And as I test solve, I'm going to pay primarily attention to the smoothness of the path and to whether I feel like there are any points where I'm just looking at part of the grid thinking, man, I really wish Clover had given me more here. Because whenever I'm looking at that and having that thought, that's a sign that I need to be giving more givens. So I'm actually also going to unhighlight my givens here, just because I want to see this the same way that my solvers would see it. I probably, just for symmetry's sake, am going to include another arrow or two, to be honest. And I do that sometimes, shamelessly. Just stick things in the grid just solely for the sake of symmetry. Okay, so I'm starting in the top left corner. So in my solve, these cells have to be 1, 2, 3, 4. They can't be a 3, so they have to be 1, 2, 4. Those are not 4s, so my 4 is here. This has to be greater than 5. It's 6, 7, 8, or 9. 3 is the greatest here, so those have to be 1 or 2. That resolves this. I have a hidden 7 in a row here. Not something I was thinking about while I was setting it, but it's valid. The 7 is the greatest value here, so that doesn't have a 9. That's actually a 9. And the 5 resolves that. This can only be a 3 or a 4. These are all 3, 4, 8, 9. These are not 8, so that's an 8. So that's not an 8, so that's an 8. And I find that it's feeling pretty natural to make those Sudoku deductions that I was kind of worried about up in the top left, so I'm pretty comfortable with those. Okay, so my next place to go is going to be this 5, probably. I see 2, 3, and 4 having to go in there, so that's now a 3. This is now a 2, 4 pair, which gets resolved immediately by that 4 that I placed later on. That all cleans this up. And what does that leave me in here? That leaves me a 6, 7, 9. That can't be a 9. That's not a 6. That's not a 7. Don't love that, but you know, it's all right. 1, 2, 3, that places a 2. Now I have this 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of quad here, and not phenomenally useful. Okay. This is the first point where I'm looking at it and I'm starting to have the thought as a solver, I'm gonna have to bash a little bit. I'm starting to have that temptation to like just fill random pencil marks into cells and just like beat it half to death with pencil marks until something just pops out of it somehow. Now that I'm pausing and looking at it, of course, I'm seeing another hidden 7 in a column, but I think I already expressed how I feel about using hiddens and columns and rows in this solve. And I think this is my opportunity probably to put some arrows in, especially the top right, but also the bottom left, because I think this top right now, this being like naked, is really screaming. Like it's really saying, hey, there should be something going on up here, but there isn't. And so in my intended solution at this point, what do I have? I have a 1, 2, 5, and 4 in this top corner. Does putting an arrow pointing to that 5, does that do anything nice for me? I think that's a good question to ask at this point. So like if I put an arrow there, that's kind of inviting people to say, okay, this has got to be 1, 2, 4, 9. I already know it's not a 9, so that's a 9, that's a 4. That's not a 4, that's not a 2, or a 4. So that's a 1. So far, having an arrow there has not changed the logic in the slightest. What it has done, though, is having an arrow there has served as kind of an invitation to solvers to think, okay, it's safe for me to like go try to write out what all of the candidates are going to be here. Like that's likely to lead to something fruitful. It's a signpost almost. Okay, and I'm just noticing now that I have broken my puzzle. So I'm going to back up a little bit. That's not 1, 2, 4. That's actually 1, 4, 6. Neither of those are 4s, so that's a 4. Okay. Now, that's 2, 5, and 7. Nope, not 2, 5, and 7. 2, 3, and 5. That's not a 2. Okay, this can't be pointing to a 2 or 3. That actually has to be pointing to a 5 because it has to be greater than the 4. Similarly, that's not a 6, so that's a 1. That's a 2. All right, I think I'm going to keep that because I like what that did to the solve path. At this point, I have this pretty free too. I know this can't be a 9 and that can't be a 6. Okay. Now my attention is drawn here. And this is something I didn't notice earlier, but now I'm looking at that. I'm looking that that's going to be a 9, so this now becomes a 6, 7, 8. And it's just jumped out at me that this has resolved in like an extremely different way than I intended it to when I started setting. I intended that to be like a really early move, kind of resolving that 6, 7, 8. But once there's more in the grid, it turns out there's an easier, kind of lower resistance way to get at that. And that's completely fine and completely normal in setting something like this. Okay, so that's going to be 5, 6, 8 triple. This is now 1, 3. At this point, where am I at? Okay, so this is actually the second point in my solve, where I'm now looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, I wish I had more. Wish I had more to play with here. And I think this is my chance to use my bottom right. Because I knew that I was going to be able, if I wanted to fit an arrow in the bottom right pointing at the 8 with the sharing its quad with the 7. And I'm going to do exactly that now. I'm going to put an arrow here. That tells me, because this digit cannot be a 9, that it must be an 8. And that kind of invites me to look at all this. This is a 2, 6 pair. This is 5, 9. That's a 9. That's a 5. So this has to be greater than 5. That has to be 7, 8, or a 9. That's an 8 or a 9. All right. Now where do we go from here? I see a hidden 7 in this box. It's a little marginal, but not tough to see necessarily. And with that hidden 7, that does resolve this. I worry that we're going off the rails just a tiny bit with that. I think there's not a lot of it, so I feel like it's probably okay. Okay, so here's the situation where we have to have a unique 7 there, so that can't be 7. That's got to be our 7, and that resolves like this. That's 5, 6, 8, 9. One of those is definitely going to be a 5. That 7 now places a 6, a 9, and a 7 here. That does this stuff that we were enjoying over there on the kind of center left. This is now a 5, 6 pair. This is now our 1, 2, 3 triple. These are 4, 5, and 6. So this resolves immediately as soon as we notice that that consists of, whoops, 4, 5, and 6. Did I break my own puzzle again? Oh, I might have. No, I didn't. That's a 6, that's a 5, that's a 4. I break things constantly while setting them, just to be clear. And it's something where at a certain point I stopped worrying about it. I just noticed that I didn't need this arrow, but you know, there's no rule against redundant clues in gas. Sometimes people point them out to me, but honestly, there are way more redundant clues in gas that nobody ever notices, or at least not enough to point out to me. So I think in general, they rarely do any harm in that context. This is now going to be a 1 and a 9, 3 and a 1. 2, 6, 2, 1, 3. So now we're solved. And at that point, I am pretty satisfied with the solution path. This is kind of the point where I would send this to private gas testing to have some times come in, to have kind of some people's comments on it. I, in all likelihood, will go through and solve it one more time. What I will definitely do with something like this, especially because I'm setting in Penpa, which is not going to really do any kind of answer checking for me, is I will go through and one by one, before I send this to testing, I will check all of my uses of the constraints, and I'll make sure that the arrows that I've placed actually are pointing to the largest digit in their quad. Because it's really easy to make a mistake and just accidentally, you know, put a constraint in early, think to yourself, I'm going to let this resolve correctly at the end, and then it turns out you resolved it completely backwards. So that's an easy mistake to make, and honestly, if I've done that and you're looking at it on the screen right now and screaming at me, sorry, I will find it before I post this in testing. And that's kind of what my process looks like. I hope that this was interesting for you to see. I hope that, really, if there's one thing that I hope that people take away from this, it's that you don't necessarily need like one incredibly intricate and complex break-in move to make a puzzle that feels fun and satisfying and flows. All you really need is to keep in mind what people are likely to be looking at any given juncture as they're solving it, and just take that and say, okay, you've looked at this, now I'll show you where your next step is. You know, once you're on the stepping stone in the middle of the river, all of a sudden, once you're down there, you can see where the next stone is. And if my puzzles feel like that, then I've achieved what I'm going for with gas. Thank you for watching this. Again, hope it was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me with questions or thoughts. I'm honestly not really going to do any editing on this. I'm just going to upload this video as is. This is not meant for CTC or anything. This is just meant to be pretty casual. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks for hanging out with me for a little while, and I hope you enjoy the puzzle.